Hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting lecture by your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald Brown. Our topic for today is the Irish Catholic immigration experience. A lot of you might be of Irish ancestry or have part Irish family. And the Irish immigration experience is really one of the unique chapters in American history. In our topic for today, we're going to be talking about the immigration, why they came, for what reasons, how they survived in a hostile city overwhelmingly dominated by European Protestants, how they managed to gain political power and then to create an Irish Catholic empire in the New World. Then how they went on to greater social, economic, political acceptance. And then looking back is how the Irish remember their own immigration experience. So once again, Dr. Ronald Brown, welcoming you to another exciting lecture. Well, the Irish are but one of the immigrant groups who have migrated to the United States. Well, we all know about the Irish immigration, potato famine. The Germans came over in the mid-1800s. 1870s was a large period of Italian immigration, Eastern European, Jewish and Christian, and Eastern Orthodox Christian population. We're aware now of the mass migration of Chinese, of Africans, of Middle Eastern people, Southern Americans, Mexicans migrating to the United States. So we are, as this graph indicates, in an age of mass migration. No longer just migration to the vast new territories of North and South America, which were populated by European immigrants and forced immigrants from Africa, the African slaves. But today, migration, mass migration, is a global phenomenon. As I speak, millions of Africans, North African Arabs and Southern Africans and Middle Easterners are going on any way possible to cross the Mediterranean and find a new homeland in Europe. The Chinese are spreading around the world, building Chinatowns from Southern Africa to Canada, from Argentina to Russia. So mass migration is no longer something in history of populating the vast new territories of Australia, South Africa, and the Americas, but now it is a global reality. And we can learn a lot about migration, the survival of migrants, their difficulties they encounter by studying the Irish immigration experience. Now, the Chinese can learn a lot from the Irish because, like the Irish and like the Germans and the Filipinos, the Indians in Kenya and East Africa, the Mexicans coming across the border, and South Americans and Central Americans to get to the United States and Canada, none of these groups had any intention of assimilating. For them, the melting pot was a threat. Well, as you can see on the right, the German immigrants to America eventually lost their language. They assimilated, and like me, I am, predominantly German background, but a little bit of everything else thrown into the family. Well, the Irish managed to balance the melting pot with ethnic, cultural, and religious survival. Now, as we look into the 21st century, we're in the year 2021 now, we are at the beginning of the third millennium. How are the immigrants of today, the Chinese, the Filipinos, the Mexicans, the Africans, the Vietnamese, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Turks, and the Israelis who are migrating around the world, how are they going to experience immigration? Are they going to be able to survive, or will they disappear into the melting pot? Well, the phenomenon of migration today has far surpassed that of the Irish immigration of the early 1800s or the German immigration of the same time. What we are seeing today is a global refugee situation. Picture on the right shows me firsthand experience with refugees working among the Vietnamese boat people in Southeast Asia for the United Nations. Not too long ago, Germany agreed to admit 1 million Muslim immigrants from the Middle East. Donald Trump tried to stop Muslim migration, stop Mexican migration, and keep America white and Christian dominated. But now, under President Biden, the gates are being opened. But who knows what is going to happen during the next election? But we cannot deny that global refugees, global migration is a phenomenon of the present and will no doubt continue well into the future. In the past, migrants have left for various reasons. Famous Armenian genocide of 1915 and 16, when Turkey slaughtered or expelled the bulk of its Armenian and later Greek populations. Vietnamese fled the overthrow of the American-sponsored regime in South Vietnam and sought refuge wherever they could find it. 6 million Palestinians remain exiled from their homeland in refugee camps, 2 million dumped in the Gaza Strip camp. Here again, refugees fleeing warfare, fleeing persecution, fleeing genocide. We also have Syrian refugees fleeing warfare in Syria, Iraq, and in Lebanon, which is in constant political upheaval. A new phenomenon are climate refugees, fleeing the desertification of northern Mexico and Africa. The climate change is forcing millions to flee Bangladesh, a low-lying country which will no doubt be underwater within a decade. We know about the Jewish refugee situation, fleeing persecution by the Tsar and then later by the communists, and to the fall of the Soviet Union. Millions of Russian Jews fled to either Israel or to Europe, or large numbers to New York City. So the refugee crisis is continuing, but it is constantly changing. The Irish did not come because of climate change. They came because of religious and linguistic and cultural persecution by the English. But today, climate refugees, war refugees, various reasons for fleeing their countries. Now, the Irish immigration of the 1840s and 50s is a unique situation. Once again, every immigrant group that arrives in another country has its own story to tell, its own unique experience. On the map, we see the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. From the 1700s and even before, Ireland was the goal of English expansion. England took over Wales and Scotland, invaded Ireland, and added it to its growing empire. So long before the English were taking over half of Africa, India, Pakistan, Canada and the United States, they had their first colonial experience in taking over Scotland, Wales, and especially Ireland. Well, the British, not only in South Africa and India and the Americas, but also in Ireland, were an excessively brutal occupation force. They sought and did everything they could to stamp out the Catholic religion of the Irish, destroy the Gaelic language, destroy Irish culture, keep the people largely uneducated and unskilled as cheap, near slave labor for the English landlords, relegating the Irish to farmers and peasants, keeping them illiterate, driving them to alcoholism, poverty. Many women, the only way they could survive was through prostitution. Carting off Irish men to jail. Well, what do you call the wagon you cart them off in? The paddy wagon, after the name Patrick. So even before the Great Potato Famine, the Irish were fleeing Ireland to South Africa, to Australia, to New Zealand, to France, even to London to find a better situation, but largely to the United States and Canada. Between 1830 and 40, 200,000 had migrated to New York City, with another 300,000 to the rest of the United States. Of course, they were relegated to whatever job was available. The potato famine of 1845 to 1850 spurred another million to the United States. Following between 1860 and 80, another million. Well, with no skills other than farming, largely illiterate, Catholic, no education, they settled in the slums of the Lower East Side in New York, the famous 5 Points area, and similar Irish slums from Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Maryland, Washington, D.C., and any other East Coast city that would have them. So they were, in a way, refugees fleeing first economic and religious persecution, and later the infamous potato famine. But when they arrived in New York City, they immediately encountered a very well structured and rigid social pyramid. The Knickerbockers of Dutch and English origin were the upper class, the landowners, the store owners, the real estate owners, the factory owners. The middle class were the English, French, and Germans who had skills and who were opening little stores and worked in banks and had at least a basic education and had hopes of rising eventually to the upper class. The skilled laborers of New York City were African Americans. They were the barbers, they were the cooks, they were the butchers, they were the blacksmiths. So when the Irish arrived, they were at the bottom of this rigid social pyramid. The vast majority of the skilled laborers, the African Americans, had become Protestants. The middle class, English, French, and Germans, were predominantly Protestant. And of course, the Dutch and English were militantly Protestant. So economically, linguistically, socially, religiously, the Irish were at the bottom. And the Protestant majority left no doubt that they did not welcome these Irish Catholic primitive people invading their peaceful land. Thomas Nast, a German illustrator, was famous for depicting the Irish as crocodiles, swimming across from Ireland disguised as Catholic bishops sent by Rome to take over Protestant America and to make it into a part of the growing Catholic empire. Magazines such as the one on the right, we see the portrayal of the Irish man with his shamrocks and the harp on his sash, shamrock in his mouth, but once again depicted by the Protestant nativists as a semi-barbaric creature. Even so-called medical and scientific journals depicted the upper class white woman in contrast to the Irish immigrant, almost ape-like looking creature. In fact, the Irish were not even considered white. I mean, white in America in the 18 years of the early republic, 1820s and 30s, was white and Protestant. And so many people considered the Irish as not white, but closer to apes or primitive peoples. Well, in this hostile environment, the Irish had to do what they could to survive, to protect their first churches, their clubs, their neighborhoods. They organized their own gangs. The most infamous of the Irish gangs were the Dead Rabbits. They were the ones who defended the Irish whenever the nativists would attack their neighborhood or invade a bar and beat up people or rob them. They would barricade the streets and they would fight back. Well, it was an uphill battle. I mean, signs, no Irish need apply, appeared everywhere that a company simply would not hire. A store would simply not hire a Irish Catholic worker. So the gangs did what they could to defend their people, defend their first stores, take care of new immigrants. Now, a similar situation occurred when the Italian Catholics started coming over in the 1870s and 80s. They established their own gangs. The mafia was the Italian gang, which was out to defend them. Today, we have Hispanic gangs. We have African-American gangs, once again, turning their lower class status, their poverty, their discrimination into a battle cry. The book by Herbert Asbury, The Gangs of New York, well portrays the status of the lower class Irish of the 5 Points area in lower Manhattan. It was even made into a fascinating movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, Daniel Day-Lewis, and Cameron Diaz, portraying the difficulties that the Irish and other immigrants encountered in a fiercely Protestant, nativistic, anti-Catholic, and anti-Irish city. Well, the situation slowly got worse. During the Civil War, when the first Irish immigrants had arrived and were established, and the millions of potato famine Irish had arrived, the situation blew up in the 1860s, in the middle of the Civil War. The African Americans until that time were the established urban skilled workers, the carpenters, the barbers, the blacksmiths, the tailors, the sailors, the cooks. Whereas the Irish were the lower class, unskilled urban workers, day workers, laborers, gangsters, drug dealers, bar owners, gambling dens, and criminals. Well, the only way that the Irish were ever going to improve their status, to rise in the social scale, was to displace the African Americans. Well, the Irish were viciously opposed to the Civil War because they feared that if some 4 million African American slaves in the South were suddenly given their freedom, they were going to do just like the Irish did, flock into the big cities of the Northeast looking for jobs. Even more impoverished than the Irish, they would work for less. Well, in the middle of the Civil War, the Irish rose in revolt. They started rioting in the streets, opposed to the Civil War. And don't forget, many of the Irish, out of desperation, had signed up for the army. In fact, they were the largest contingent of soldiers in the Northern Army, not because they supported Abraham Lincoln, but because they had to make money however they could and bring over the rest of their family. Well, in New York, the tension between the Irish and the anti-Civil War Irishmen and the African Americans broke into revolt. The Irish started attacking African American stores, hotels, restaurants, bars, churches, orphan asylums. And the result was a mass exodus of African Americans from New York City. African American population of New York City dropped dramatically during the Civil War. And the Irish let the newly liberated slaves from the South, they let them know New York was not a welcoming place, nor was Philadelphia, nor Boston. Stay in the South, go somewhere else, but do not come to New York. This fear of liberated slaves flooding into the city turned to anger. Here we see the draft riots of New York City. They're called draft riots. They should be called the race riots because it was Irish against African Americans. And we see from the picture on the right, African American neighborhoods were burned to the ground. The African American Orphan Asylum on 42nd Street, right off of Fifth Avenue, was burned to the ground. Churches, schools, clubs, homes were leveled. And the African Americans fled the city in droves. So began, tragically, the rise of the Irish to positions of importance. The first goal was to gain political power because the Irish very well early realized that in a democracy, numbers were voters. And the huge numbers of Irish who were flooding into the city were voters. They took over a democratic political institution called Tammany Hall, which had existed before the arrival of the Irish, but they took it over and they turned it into the Irish democratic political machine. Now, why were they so interested in gaining political power? Well, first, the government offered jobs. So you can imagine the priest of a Catholic church somewhere in New York going up to some Protestant who wanted to be elected mayor or some other political office and saying, I will announce in my church every day for the next 2 weeks that my people should vote for you. In exchange, I want you to appoint Irish Catholic policemen, Irish Catholic firefighters, hire Irish Catholics as garbage collectors, civil servants, hire Irish workers on every construction project undertaken by the city. Now, this is called ethnic politics, and it exists until today. We just here in New York had the Democratic runoff to see who was going to be the new Democratic candidate for mayor of the city. Well, it was Hispanics, it was African Americans, and it was Asians. Here again, each one would go to the Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn and strike a deal. They would go to Harlem and strike a deal with African American pastors. They go to Flushing and strike a deal with the Chinese and the Koreans. In exchange for votes, what will you give us? This is patronage. This is ethnic politics. So the Irish mastered that very well, and they had a large number of captive voters. Well, what was going on in New York and New York State, as well as the city, during the mid 1800s when the Irish were flocking in? Well, the city and the nation was growing. The Erie Canal, which stretches from Albany in upstate New York the whole way across to Buffalo, with linking canals down to Binghamton, up to Lake Ontario, through Rochester, Syracuse. This was a giant building site. Well, who were the builders? The Irish. Central Park had been laid out and begun construction in 1858. Who did the city hire to do all of the dirty work? Irish. No African Americans, Irish workers. So the Irish, in one way, were lucky that they arrived at a time when New York, upstate New York, and the nation was in a growth spree. The first railroads were being built. Who was constructing them? Irish workers. And of course, a railroad is more than just cutting down trees and putting down ties. You build tracks, you build bridges, you have giant coal mines in eastern Pennsylvania, where the Molly Maguire, the Irish labor gangs got their start. The Croton Aqueduct was being built, bringing water through giant tunnels from upstate New York, the Adirondack Mountains, down into the reservoir, which was built where the New York Public Library is today. Brooklyn Bridge, paving the streets of New York. In the early 1800s, the streets were still seas of mud in a rainstorm. Well, if the city's going to pave the streets, well, then they hire Irish workers. Bridges. And of course, in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War of the 1840s, the Irish could always sign up as soldiers. And so the Irish took advantage of this. By gaining political power, they also got jobs. Until today, we jokingly talk about the Irish cops who dominate the police force, the Irish policemen. Constant lawsuits by African Americans and Hispanics saying, why are there only Irish cops? Why are there only Irish firefighters? And this is the reason why, because they made a deal with the government, jobs in exchange for votes. The Irish also started getting involved in organizing labor. They were not going to be slave laborers. They were going to be unionized laborers. The Molly Maguires of eastern Pennsylvania, Scranton area coal mines was viciously destroyed by the government, Pinkerton police, and by the owners of the mines. But the Irish went on establishing more and more trade unions, such as the Irish women workers working in the textile industry, the Irish Trade Union Congress, and its earlier incarnations of Irish labor organizations. Well, once the Irish started getting political power, they not only got jobs, but they realized that they had to finally and once and for all displace the African Americans who still remained in the city and who still dominated skilled labor, such as barbers, carriage drivers, workers, and even owners of restaurants, bars, and hotels, longshoremen, the men who unload ships, sailors, rooming houses, domestics. Rich Protestant family on Fifth Avenue would have an African butler, would have African cooks, butchers, and cooks. Well, once the Irish started getting political power, they convinced the new mayors, they convinced the new governors and the other politicians. Don't forget, during this period, Brooklyn was an independent city. Queens was a county. Flushing was an independent city. So there were a lot of political people to influence and influence them to pass northern version of Jim Crow laws. One such law said that a black man can only cut the hair of another black man, which meant that suddenly Irish barbers had a captive market. African Americans were banned from driving carriages, from working in restaurants. Ship captains were convinced that they would rather hire Irish workers than African Americans. Domestics, rich families found it very unfashionable to hire a black butler and have black cooks in the kitchens. So by the passage of Jim Crow laws in New York City, the Irish began to displace the well-entrenched and highly skilled African-American workers in the city. Well, this union between millions of Irish Catholic voters and politicians, even if the politician wasn't even Catholic, still even a Protestant candidate for mayor would welcome the vote of a couple 100,000 Irish Catholics. And this continues until today. Cardinal Spellman, a good Irish Catholic, who became Archbishop and later Cardinal of New York, 1939 to 67, had so much power in the United States that when he inaugurated his Al Smith dinners, Al Smith was the first Catholic mayor of the city. Well, when he inaugurated these dinners in 1945, held every year at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, it is obligatory for political figures to attend. On the right, you see Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan being welcomed by the Cardinal of New York City, Cardinal Spellman, to a dinner. And these continue until today and are a sign of the Irish Catholic political power in the city and in the country. Well, in addition to getting political power and everything that brought with it, the Irish also realized that they had to defend their Catholic identity from encroachment by the Protestants. Yes, they were in America. Yes, they were part of New York City political economic life, but they did not want to disappear into the Protestant masses. Central to this Catholic autonomy movement was Archbishop John Hughes. 1797, born in Ireland, 1817, came to New York, was appointed Bishop of New York in 1842, just in time to welcome the millions of immigrants fleeing the potato famine. He was made an archbishop in 1850 and died toward the end of the Civil War in 1864. He was the man who single-handedly created an Irish Catholic empire in America and with its headquarters in the Empire City, New York City. Well, Catholicism had been illegal in New York, both under the Dutch from 1624 to 1664, and later under the English from 1664 until the American Revolution. Catholicism was only made legal in 1784 following the American Revolution and the evacuation of New York City by the British. Well, needless to say, there were Catholics in the city even during those terrible days of Dutch and English Protestant persecution. Months after the legalization of Catholicism, the first St. Peter's Church, which you see on the left, was built down just off of the Hudson River. Today on the right, we see the new current St. Peter's Church. This is the first Catholic church in New York City. Well, the Irish, when they started coming, they built their own St. Patrick's Church, 1815. Here we see it on the left, and on the right, we see the church as it is today, made of field stone. Look at the picture on the right, surrounded by a wall, because the Protestants would constantly stone the church, especially at midnight mass and on other Catholic holidays. So, of course, when the Irish came, they wanted their own church, and they rapidly became the largest number of Catholics in New York City, outnumbering the few Spanish Catholics, a handful of German Catholics, a handful of French Catholics who had attended St. Peter's, but the Irish wanted their own Irish Catholic Church, and that was the origin of old St. Patrick's Church, later the Cathedral. Well, Archbishop John Hughes had two nicknames. One was Old Bricks and Mortar, because he built 100 Catholic churches for a booming population of 500,000 Catholics in the New York City area. He built not only churches, but beside every church, there was a school, established Catholic newspapers, clubs, convents, monasteries, and built an entire Catholic infrastructure, so that a young Catholic child could be baptized in one of his churches, educated in one of his schools, read his newspapers, attend his clubs, maybe join a convent or monastery, or work on one of the Catholic labor projects, such as the Central Park or the Erie Canal or the Croton Reservoir, or paving the streets, and be buried from a Catholic church in a Catholic cemetery. Well, his second nickname was Dagger John, because he was not only a builder, old bricks and mortar, but he was also a defender of the Catholics, saying that every Catholic man should have a dagger in his boot, and if anybody dared attack one of his Irishmen, he was obliged to take out that dagger and to make sure that was the last Catholic that Protestant would ever attack. Well, of course, to get ahead in every sphere of life, you had to have educated Catholics. So when you graduated from the local Catholic church school, there was Fordham University, 1841, St. Francis College in Brooklyn, 1858, St. John's University, 1870. The statue on the right shows the statue of John Hughes presiding over the campus of Fordham University. John Hughes' sister, Mother Mary Angela Hughes, founded College of Mount St. Vincent in 1847, became a nun, founded a religious order. This was the first Catholic college in New York City for women. Uniquely, the Catholic Church has always had a very prominent place for women. unlike the Protestants and Jews who had a very low view of women in synagogues, relegating them to a balcony or area behind a curtain, and Protestants who only allowed men to become preachers. The Catholics had a central position for women. Women became saints. Women were martyrs. Women like Mother Mary Angela Hughes could establish religious orders where nuns were educated. They staffed the schools, that they staffed the orphanages, they staffed the Catholic hospitals, and so they had to be educated. Now, one of the very early Catholic women, even under the period of persecution, was St. Elizabeth Seton from Staten Island, a good English Protestant Episcopalian who, on a trip to Italy, converted to Catholicism. And on the right, you see the Elizabeth Seton Shrine. She's canonized as saint in Lower Manhattan, overlooking the harbor. So there were Catholics before, but Catholic women very often took the forefront in establishing women's religious orders. We can't underestimate the power of nuns and the importance of religious women. When you just look at these nuns and you ask yourself, how much money do they spend on makeup? How much money do they spend every week to have their hair done? How much money do they spend on fancy clothes? How much time do they devote to an abusive husband and ever demanding kids? Zero. They devote their entire lives to their work, whether it was hospital nurses, teachers, university professors. In fact, my own aunt, my father's sister, became a nun, and she ended up being the most highly educated woman of that generation of women when women did not go to college. She got a BA and she got an MA and ended up president of a Catholic college, signing contracts for millions. And so John Hughes recognized that his empire would only function if it had scores of volunteers. Now, John Hughes also had very good contacts with Rome and would convince various religious orders in Europe to send over nuns from France, from Ireland, from Spain, from Portugal, from Germany, and from Italy to staff his universities and to staff his hospitals. St. Vincent's Hospital, 1849. On the left, you see a rather nice tree-lined street with the first St. Vincent's Hospital. And then on the right, we see the recently constructed ultra-modern St. Vincent's Hospital. Once again, when you have a hospital, you need nurses, you need administrators, you need doctors, you need healthcare professionals. So his university system and college system would provide for the Irish Catholic infrastructure. Of course, all this needs money. So he established in 1850 the Immigrant Savings Bank. The building on the left still stands right beside City Hall. Immigrant savings banks all across the city. Here again, building the financial infrastructure to finance his religious infrastructure. It was John Hughes who laid the foundation stone for St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1858. And where was it located? Right on the bastion of the New York Knickerbocker English and Dutch Protestant elite, Fifth Avenue. Putting his foot down, saying Catholics are now part of the power structure of the city. Now, this tradition of Catholic archbishops or cardinals assuming a major role in American Catholicism continued under Cardinal Francis Joseph Spellman. He was the Cardinal Archbishop of New York from 1939 to 67, meaning during the Second World War period, he was the most powerful religious cardinal prelate in the Catholic Church, not only in America, but around the world. During World War II, when Italy was occupied by the Nazis, as well as most of Western Europe, the Catholic Church suffered devastating losses because of the war. Following the war, the division of Europe, the Iron Curtain, put millions of Polish, Czech, Slovak, Hungarian, Slovenian, Croatian, as well as Romanian and Russian Catholics and Christians behind the Iron Curtain of the atheistic communism. So Cardinal Francis Spellman remained the most important Catholic prelate in America and the world. So the Irish success story was very, very important. It showed how a group can arrive and succeed in a country that is hostile. It can get political power, economic power, intellectual power, and it can be successful, but retain its own identity. In fact, see a list of some of the famous Irish Americans, from Grace Kelly, George O'Keeffe, the painter, John McEnroe, the tennis pro, Bill O'Reilly on radio, Henry Ford, the entrepreneur, Tom Clancy, the author, Walt Disney of Hollywood, Bing Crosby, actor, singer. So here again, Irish Americans, whether they're John Kennedy or great actors of Hollywood, are very proud of their Irish ancestry and testify to the miraculous survival and success of the Irish in a hostile environment. George O'Keeffe, the great painter of the Southwest of New York, here again, one of the great Irish women of America. Of course, very significant was the election of John F. Kennedy in 1961, the great and powerful Kennedy clan of Boston, another success story, one of what we call America's Emerald Kings, the 5-generation history of the ultimate Irish Catholic family. Now, this success story historically has served as a model for subsequent immigrants. The Irish were the first to confront the Protestant monopoly on power in New York. They were the first non-Protestant group. The Germans, who came over at the same time, were the first non-English speaking group to confront the American Protestant English background population. And so the Irish continue to inspire new immigrants that the American dream, house in Levittown, a car, a dog, a backyard, a front yard, and everything else, is accessible to immigrants from wherever they come. Chinese immigrants suffered horrendous discrimination. In fact, when the Chinese started coming over, they were greeted not only with hostility, but Congress passed the anti-Asian immigration law in the late 1800s, banning Chinese immigration to America. The only other example we have such of of such a racist approach to immigration was under Donald Trump when he attempted to ban Muslim immigration to America. And so the Irish are always center stage when it comes to immigration. And new immigrants look back to the success of the Irish. Now, remembering the Irish, even though the Irish have become ultimate Americans, even though many of them no longer continue to practice any form of Catholicism. In fact, you probably find as many ex-Irish Catholics as you do Irish Catholics. But still, they do come together on their annual St. Patrick's Festival parade on Fifth Avenue and celebrations across the country. The Irish St. Patrick's Day Parade is the oldest ethnic parade in New York City, going back to colonial times of all times. Well, today, every ethnic group aspires to have its own Fifth Avenue parade celebrating its ethnic roots and celebrating its survival. Many books have been written about the Irish immigration experience. The Graves Are Walking, The Great Famine and the Saga of the Irish People, Black 47, Disaster of the Irish Potato Famine. Once again, especially during Irish Heritage Week and St. Patrick's Day parades, PBS will have a whole series of programs on Irish music, on Irish culture, on Irish history. In Lower Manhattan, there is the Irish Hunger Museum, opened in 2002, portraying the Irish landscape, poverty, the potato fields, once again, sponsoring programs, films, books, and everything else right at the foot of the World Trade Center. There are other museums and other memorials across the country celebrating the Irish success. The Irish Historical Society on Fifth Avenue, you see on the left in an old Victorian mansion. And you have all kinds of programs at the museum, also sponsored at other museums, historical societies, PBS, movies, and across the country. The Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany, New York, and in other places, sponsoring panel discussions, films, and the release of books and articles on the Irish historical experience. So the Irish success story continues to influence American history, continues to inspire people, because it is such a unique story in American history. Germans likewise brought over their culture and made their contribution to American history. And today, the saga of immigrants finding a homeland in America continues, whether it's the Muslims who are struggling against vicious opposition and racism and oppression in America, trying to carve out their own homeland in America. And of equal importance is the global phenomenon of migration and refugees as we speak. Whether it's millions of Africans and Arabs and Middle Easterners trying to make a new home in Europe or in South America, North America, Australia, will they survive in the future? What is going to be the future of an America if it bans Muslim migration or stops Chinese migration or builds a wall against Mexicans? Will the ultra-right wing prevail and keep a white Christian America? Or will America remain open to immigrants from around the world, wherever they choose to migrate from? This is the dilemma that the United States and the rest of the world is struggling with now. France struggling to stop Muslim immigration, forcibly assimilate them into their own secular vision of a country. In the United States, we had the experience of Donald Trump trying to return to the golden age before 1965, when all these Mexicans and Chinese and Arabs and Jews started flooding into the United States. India is struggling with its own identity. Can India be a multicultural, multi-religious country? Or is it, under the current rule of the BJP, become a militant Hindu country? So these are issues facing most of the countries of the world. What kind of future is the world going to be? Is it going to be a globalized world, or is it going to be a world where every nation barricades itself behind its protective walls and excludes anybody who is different? I often wonder, in the future, if aliens start arriving from alien planets, are we going to have a Martian ghetto in New York with vicious racism attacks on them? If they bring their alien languages and cultures and foods and religions, will they suffer the same discrimination in the Irish as the Irish did? Will they, like the Irish, be able to carve out their own little ethnic enclaves, preserve their cultures with their restaurants, with their clubs, with their languages, or will they be rejected? So the questions that America encountered in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s with the arrival of millions of Irish Catholic immigrants and refugees remains very much part of the world today as we move well into the 21st century and as we move into the third millennium. The shape of not just America, but of the planet is going to be determined by the same forces that were at play with the Irish immigration. So once again, this is Dr. Ronald Brown, thanking you very much for joining me today. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to send me an email to ronbrownmedia@gmail.com and I will respond. And I always welcome contributions, new ideas. It seems every time I give a talk such as this, when I'm finished, I take my PowerPoint, tear it apart, and redo it, adding new information every time I give it. So I would like to thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you in the near future for another exciting talk. Thank you very much. This is Dr. Ronald Brown logging off.